Good evening, and thank you for joining us. This is the first of a series of music forums that we're implementing this year. I wanted to do something to keep music alive and flourishing during these extraordinary times in which we all find ourselves. So we've implemented this series in order to keep you, our audiences, engaged in music, for us to continue to be able to speak about and play music, to keep artists involved as well, and to keep the general arts culture alive throughout these times. The series of music forums is manifold. We have a number of different types of events. For this one, this very first one, I'm very pleased to have with us Hannah Harris, who is the CEO of Plymouth Culture, and we will be talking about culture in Plymouth, and we'll be discussing ongoing Arts Institute initiatives with respect to music throughout our season. And we'll also invite questions from you, from our audience. There are ways in which you can send us questions, which we'd love to address as we move through this music forum together. So Hannah has been supporting creativity and culture in her current position as CEO of Plymouth Culture, both for individuals and on a citywide basis. This is all part of a larger 10-year cultural plan. And so, Hannah, maybe you could tell us a little bit about this and kick this off, and then we'll talk a little bit about music, and I'll play a little bit, and we'll have an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much for welcoming me here. And I think I'm absolutely in agreement with you. There's so much happening in Plymouth, so the ability to show that kind of culture's still alive is absolutely critical. So we had a 10-year culture plan written 10 years ago now to take us up to 2020. And it's really interesting when you look at it now. It was all about making the case for culture, just explaining why culture was important and why we had to have it. And when I think about where we've come to now as a city, I mean, it's immense in terms of the progress that's been made, the work that's been done, and the kind of developmental activity that's happened in the city. A lot of that in a very, very DIY way, which maybe we'll come back to later, because I think it's quite relevant to kind of where we are now.
Okay.
So we've got to this point where we have the opportunity to develop another 10-year culture strategy, and I'm privileged enough to be leading on that work. So, you know, the question starts, where do you start with that kind of project? Particularly in Plymouth, actually, because there's so much happening. But for us, there's an opportunity, I think, which we may not have foreseen when we started the engagement process, but that actually COVID has afforded us this opportunity to really stop and reflect, and not just churn out a document, but really look at a strategy that helps us change and transform and be a bit brave and a bit radical in terms of what we're doing. And I don't necessarily think that would have been the case if we hadn't have had this pandemic kind of literally stop us in our tracks.
Right. Well, these certainly are unusual times, and I think that, you know, anything that we can do to leverage our knowledge and our, you know, passionate belief in culture and propagation of culture, I think is great. One of the things that strikes me is that all great art, and since we're talking about music today, we'll focus a little bit more on that. Music is timeless.
Yeah.
And music that is, you know, really good relates to, or we can relate to music that's really good no matter what. As long as we are open enough to be able to listen with an open mind and to allow the music to wash over us, so that we can react to it. So, I mean, is that part of, and education, of course, is critically important in all of this.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting, as you say, about this moment in time is that I think people are experiencing things differently, including music, either because their whole home situation has changed, either they're working from home or they're homeschooling, or they're having to deal with some of the pandemic health-based issues that are happening. And for some that's been fantastic, and for others that's been a really traumatic experience. But that whole shift in your perspective and where you are, you then hear things differently, you see things differently, you feel things differently. And I think exactly as you said, there's been this explosion in demand for arts and culture, whether that be music from the balconies or clapping on a Thursday. You know, there's been this need for communal sharing, engagement in arts and culture in a way that has really been about people living and not just having fun. It's become, I think, an even more intrinsic part of people's day-to-day lives.
That's really interesting, and I think it's good to hear that if we can all understand the value, as you said, an intrinsic value in people's everyday lives. I mean, one thing that comes to mind is a photo I saw in the New York Times several months ago of a bone flute dated at more than 10,000 years ago that was discovered in caves in southern Europe. I mean, that bone flute is not an accident. This was prehistory, and it probably wasn't the only bone flute ever made. It shows the idea of expressing oneself through music, not just singing, which is also great, but also through slightly more abstract instrumental playing. And probably some degree of technology. The makers of this bone flute knew where, or learned where, to put the holes to make the right sort of sounds. So that continues.
It is very much part of our DNA, isn't it? You know, you go back, in time in history to cave paintings and drawings, and yes, a lot of those were about communication and they were about documenting, but a lot of them weren't. They were art. They were expression, and they were there to be enjoyed or to challenge situations, to make a statement. And that's since the dawn of time. And I think there just feels like there's a moment in time where we have an opportunity to position kind of arts, culture, music in a different way. And I mean, don't want to get political, but the debates that are raging at the moment in terms of the value of culture, and not just in economic terms, but in that very core social, it's a part of being a human.
Well, you're absolutely right, and there's so many examples of that all the way through. I mean, we talked about a couple of prehistory, but if we look at some of the events that we're having in the Arts Institute, one of the big things that's coming up is the 250th anniversary of the birth of Beethoven. We're having a festival in March, a small festival. We originally had a larger one planned for this week, but we've postponed it till early March, and we're focusing obviously on Beethoven's 250th year. When you think about Beethoven, and we can come back to this, but I just wanted to point out, because he was deaf for a large part of his life, we're fortunate to have many of the letters that he wrote that are still in existence. And he, talking about the economic value of art, people view things differently. And his brother, Johann Beethoven, eventually became a landowner. And this was a big deal, in early 19th century Vienna. And he was so proud of the fact that he owned some property that he wrote his brother Ludwig van Beethoven a letter and described the property that he had bought and signed it, "Your faithful brother Johann," and in brackets or parentheses he put landowner. Ludwig van Beethoven, who had a different set of values, wrote back a letter of congratulations to his brother and signed it, "Your faithful brother Ludwig," and in parentheses wrote, "brain owner." He always felt that there was no higher aspiration in life than achieving artistry. And this manifests itself in many, many different ways throughout his life. We'll get more to that later. So,
but I think you're right in terms that the place that art, music plays in one's life is about your mind. It is about your body. It's not something that sits separate to you. It's not something that you walk past or through. It has a meaning to your very core. And I think there's something really important at the moment about how we retain that and how we value that somehow. And I don't think we're always very good at the metrics around that or describing the value of culture. We sort of, when you're in it, you know it. But I just feel that there is a new audience or an audience revisiting their love of art and culture and music in this time in a way that they're placing a different kind of emphasis on. And I just think that we need to think very carefully about how we retain that, particularly in Plymouth, as a city, as we move forward with our strategic plans, and that this moment has happened for a reason.
Well, we should take advantage of it. You're absolutely right. And I think one of the things that you just said about making sure that we capture this and retain the value is spot on. I completely agree. And I think I wonder whether it might relate to a broader or maybe more specific approach to education. Because You know, it's very easy for anyone to sit at a keyboard or a piano and wiggle their fingers, but there's a wealth of we sit on the shoulders of giants, and there's a wealth of not just greatness but levels of appreciation that we can leverage today. I mean, that's what science is all about. We're always building upon discoveries and understanding of the past. And a lot of the art in the past was so new and revolutionary at its time that it has withstood the test of time. A lot of it has fallen by the wayside because it wasn't new and revolutionary and was blasé and passé. But I think that if there are opportunities to enhance musical education or arts education, personally, I'm all for it.
Absolutely. I mean, I've worked in education for a long, long time, and in arts education. So for me, the value of that, not just to artists, but to just creative thinkers and problem solvers. And I think I remember when I was part of the Plymouth College of Art when they were setting up the free school around creative arts, and it was not about us producing artists.
Right.
It was about creative thinkers. It was about problem solvers, people who would come out with a mindset that was resilient, that was always able to take on new things, process them, and create from that.
That's great.
And actually, as we keep on seeing, and this time is no different, that's so essential to people moving forward, having resilience. Jobs are not for life these days, so it is about what new things are you going to absorb and process in a way that you can then take on different careers or take on different opportunities.
Well, this sounds great and very refreshing.
Yes.
And so, well, welcome to today.
Thank you.
Let's try to build all this moving forward.
Yeah.
That's absolutely fantastic. Let me just take a moment and talk a little bit about some of the music forums that we have coming up. Very creative people. The music forum in November, these are monthly events. So on Friday, November 6th, we have Lionel Handy, a great cellist, coming to play for us. Originally, he was scheduled to be in Hong Kong at this time, playing a concerto for cello and orchestra by actually a composer who grew up in Plymouth, a guy named Stanley Bate. But owing to COVID, that engagement was postponed. So Lionel is now very pleased to be coming here in early November, and he'll play excerpts of that piece for us, as well as a heroic piece that Bach wrote for solo unaccompanied cello. And we'll be speaking about music and art during that music forum as well. In December, we have a young, brilliant harpist from London coming, Elizabeth Bass, and she will play from her wide-ranging repertoire. The harp will discuss some of the logistics of traveling with such a large instrument, which is slightly smaller than our piano, but portable in a sense. And then moving ahead to early January, we have the conductor Mark Fortune coming. Mark and I were collaborating on the performances of Some Call It Home, the multimedia music drama that I created and am producing and directing for the Mayflower 400 festivities, that was days away from its premiere performances in Theatre Royal Plymouth in March 2020 when lockdown occurred. So those performances have now been rescheduled aiming for the week beginning 3rd of May 2021. So Mark and I will be discussing what it's like to build the music element of this work, what he is doing to prepare for a premiere, and we'll be playing some excerpts from the newly composed musical score for that. Previous to the performances of Some Call It Home in May, we do have this Beethoven Festival. So let's talk a little bit about Beethoven.
Yeah, sure.
What would you say?
Well, I mean, I think it's useful to go back to our early conversations,
okay.
If that's okay.
Let's do it.
Because I think I had, like many people, that very surface level understanding of like who Beethoven was and some of the struggles he had, and you just sort of entered a conversation with me about a person, and I had no idea that it was Beethoven. You talked about his family life with his abusive father, alcoholic father, the poverty in which he lived. And the connection between his deafness and the abuse that he suffered at the hands of his father. Like, for me, you could have been describing anyone who has been through traumatic situation, who has not necessarily been loved or respected in their time or in their circles of friends and networks. And I was really surprised when you said to me, well, this is Beethoven, this is what his life was, and how he arrived to be the person he was, and but by the end he brought Vienna to a standstill with his funeral, and for me that just opened up a conversation for us that was really interesting about how do people make a connection to music that they maybe didn't even know was there, and sometimes it's about the people behind it.
I agree with you, clearly.
Good.
It's certainly, I think the more you know, not only about the music, but the more you know about the person, in this case, the creator of the music, the more you can appreciate what he, in this case, was aiming to do, and what the reasons for his achievements really are. What was he trying to do? And why? I mean, just speaking personally as a pianist, if I perform a piece of music, I absolutely love that piece of music. Otherwise, I wouldn't play it, because I have to play it. I have to want to share what I'm feeling about that piece with everyone. And so, the question that I ask myself is, if I love a piece of music, why? What is it about that piece? It's not just a soaring melodic line. It's not just cool harmonies. It's it can be a combination of many things, including the way it feels on the piano. But the more you understand how a piece fits into a composer's creative oeuvre overall, and into a composer's life, I think the more you can understand about why the piece was written in the first place. Because if you understand why it was written, then you can understand more about why it can or should be played.
And I think, my mind is thinking of several different things here, but one of those, I think, is the value in showing the process of making music and making art as well. And that there is value in recording and documenting that process, or even inviting people into that process, I think, because it isn't just about the end product, is it? It isn't just about that polished, finished composition or artwork. There's something about process that brings an audience into your world and what you're feeling. And I think there's value in us showing that. Oh,
absolutely. There totally is value. I completely agree. And I'd like to, first I'd like to talk a little bit, or play a little bit about one of the pieces that I'm thinking about, and then dissect it to a small amount. And then talk about the process of creation. And we can document that with Beethoven, because he was an obsessive musical sketcher. And I brought something with us today to do that. So let me play a little bit of his very first piano sonata. This is a piece that Beethoven wrote when he was in his early 20s. He was not yet deaf. He was at the cusp of a brilliant career in the musical capital of Europe, Vienna at the time. And he wrote this work as a vehicle for himself as both composer and pianist. And I'll just play a little bit of the beginning. On from there. So that's just the first part. This is a sonata. It's Sonata Opus 2, number 1. And this is a 4-movement piece, 4 sections. And if we think about the way it starts, you have a a theme that opens the piece. You can think of themes, musical themes, in a way that, analogous to characters in a novel. Each musical theme has certain characteristics, they're musical, but we can try in our language that we speak to describe certain elements of the musical language, okay? So if we start with this piece again, we have a simple vector-like theme that moves up, and then there's a little curlicue at the end. So it propels us forward, and then it comes back. And we hear that for a little while in slightly different guises. And then just a curlicue. And then it's taken up a little bit lower down. Then played with. And then it dissolves. Different territory. We're in a different part of the piece altogether. We got there by having Beethoven created this theme, move forward, vector-like fashion, almost like a little rocket taking off, and then gradually he played with the elements, took it apart, and we got into the second theme area of the piece. So let's talk about the second theme. What do we notice about that? Instead of going up, it goes down. Very simple. Instead of being detached, it's connected and smooth. Instead of the curlicue like this, it's in a different direction. So the fact that these two themes are inversions of one another, the second being the inversion of the first, is planned. It's not a coincidence, but it gives us a certain sense of unity of the piece, possibly subliminal unity, whether we realize it or not. So this is part of the way Beethoven worked. He created these themes and then manipulated them in a highly musical fashion. And this is part of the strength, the architecture of the music. Now, if you hear this for the first time, you might not be aware of that.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But I, as a performer, I should be aware of that, because I'm bringing the piece to life. It's part of my responsibility, my integrity as an artist. And I'm not just speaking about myself, I'm speaking about artists, performing artists. It's part of our integrity to understand what we're doing so we can better communicate it, so we can communicate to the fullest extent possible all of the meaning, the artistic meaning of the piece, what it's saying, what it's evoking, and in some cases, why it was written. So,
well, and you spoke about it being at the cusp of his sort of career or his launch,
right.
And it feels a bit like that. Yeah. There's that sort of nervous energy to it, that it could go one way or the other. And I don't know whether that was intentional, but it feels like it is mirroring his journey into his career as well at that time.
Well, it was an adventurous journey.
Right.
You're absolutely right. This work breaks some bounds of what had happened before, and Beethoven believed in himself.
Right.
Otherwise, he wouldn't have succeeded, despite his hardships growing up, which you began to describe accurately. He believed in himself, and he wanted to separate himself from his predecessors, whom he knew. He actually had wanted to study with Mozart, but Mozart died inconveniently the year before Beethoven was able to move from Bonn to Vienna. So instead, he studied with Haydn, and the two of them nearly didn't get along all that well, and Beethoven wanted to establish himself as an adventurous young artist, which this piece goes a long way in doing. So let's move forward a couple of years. So this, 6 or 7 years after this, and Beethoven had built quite a large, following. He was on the cusp economically of needing to support himself. He was not reliant on a position with the church. He was somewhat reliant on aristocratic patronage, but not fully, and he needed to publish scores. Right? Sounds familiar in a university setting, maybe?
Yes.
And he had some early commercial successes, and rather than churning out pieces that were continuations of those commercial successes, once he achieved that, he moved in a different direction musically. But things being what they were, the onset of deafness when he was around age 30, 31, was a very major thing for him. It meant that he could no longer really play these pieces himself. He had to change his outlook. He had to write for not just himself and his group of people whom he knew, but a theoretical other future. And so rather than becoming extremely depressed about this, or actually he expressed extreme depression in a particular letter that he wrote,
Right.
but moving on from that, the very next work that he composed is this one, and I'll play a little bit of this. There, because that's where this part repeats, this part of the first movement of the sonata, Opus 53, so-called Waldstein Sonata. An enormous piece. With this work, Beethoven crossed his personal Rubicon.
Okay.
But not only his personal Rubicon, he transformed the world of music. And I know that's a big sounding statement, but it happens to be true. He wrote for a piano which was smaller than this, because the piano was evolving technologically, but his demands on the instrument were far greater on this piece than on anything that had come previously. His demands on listeners were greater, because the work doesn't go the way you expect. Where's the tune?
It does feel like he's got a point to prove here. I don't know, just when you were playing there, it felt like this was coming from a place of proving something, whether it was to himself or the audience. I don't know, but it probably both. Yeah. And he's obviously challenging people.
Right. Challenging people, you're absolutely right. Challenging people to listen in new ways. And it's a question of how we perceive what's washing over us. So how do we perceive it? There's no tune. You know, this piece, the first one that I played, there's a recognizable melody, you know? Here, where's the tune? There really is no melody in the way you would normally think of a melody. But there's a theme. There has to be a theme. Yes. So what is the theme? In this case, the theme is this chromatically descending bass line occurring over time, and it stops here at the point of greatest tension. And I'll play just that. That's not the end. again. I mean, that just leaves us, and then we start again with something slightly different. By understanding...
It's easy to miss that underlying sort of bass, though,
yeah,
without you sort of taking me through it there.
Well, you know, you don't necessarily think of music that way. You think of music as having a theme at the top, which is, you know, not really a theme that you would tend to sing.
Yeah.
Right? So if you, I mean, you cannot sing the descending bass line either. But by understanding that it's there, you can make it more dramatic. Because if I were to play this, which I would never do in a real concert, it's just a series of repeated chords. But by emphasizing, by shifting the weight of the way you play, and emphasizing the bass a little bit more, the harmonies drop down, and we as listeners sort of come down as the tension builds. I'll play that again. So we hear things differently, we perceive it differently, there are different levels of understanding.
Yeah.
And then finally, after all this transition material, we kind of get to this, which is, you know, it's a second theme of the piece, so therefore it's a second theme, but it's in the wrong key. It's not in the expected key of what, you know, if the opening is in C major, you expect a theme, you expect this kind of G major context, but it's in E major. It's pushed up. Yes. Instead of being pushed down. So there's no theme for, you know, there's no singable theme, yes, really. No melodic overarching theme for the first movement. There's nothing in the second movement. The only time you get a real sort of melodic theme that you might expect is later on in the piece, the beginning of the third movement. On from there. But what do we notice about that? The disposition of playing. The hands are in the wrong place, right? And that, you know, Beethoven, master pianist, even though he didn't really play this piece for himself, yeah, he knew what he was doing. The reason for that is that, once again, even though we have this nice theme up here, it doesn't actually start there. It starts down here. And we create this kind of misty sound by holding certain notes in a sustained fashion. And the only way to do that is to have the left hand play up here while the right hand is playing the accompaniment down, lower down. And it's hard. It's very hard to do that. It's much easier to play in a normal fashion, but by creating something that's challenging, it forces the pianist to take more care and try to, you know, understand the expressive nature of the gesture much more fully. So if you notice, by the way, speaking of some sort of thematic unity, the first note of this theme is also the first solo note of the piece. No coincidence.
I'm really intrigued though, because at the point that he made this, which is of course very challenging, yep, to audience and whoever's playing, yep, what was he playing because he knew it would be well received, or did he not care? What was that motivation?
So that's a really interesting question. Does a composer care about the way his or her works are received? And my experience with living composers, that breed exists, is generally speaking very much so.
Yeah.
However, there's a difference between caring and pandering.
Well, that's why I ask, you know, because I think this is a challenge for the city to think about what level of risk we take with culture and art. How much is it just giving an audience what they know they already want, and how much is there sort of legitimacy for the city to take some risk.
Right. So that's also a really interesting point, and it's a point that I and many other artists grapple with all the time.
Yeah.
First of all, I think as someone who's grown up since age 3 playing the piano, I think it's critically important for any serious performing artist to be involved with music of his or her own time. And there are, as I've mentioned, the breed of living composers very much exists.
Yeah.
Now, to go back to the past a tiny bit to make a point, most of us probably wouldn't know of Salieri except for the film and play Amadeus. Salieri was at least as highly regarded and certainly more commercially successful than Mozart in those days, because he created music that people wanted to hear.
Yes.
And then it faded.
Well, and many of the greats weren't necessarily respected or liked or loved in their time,
right.
were they? There was that sort of radical element that got them pigeonholed as a bit crazy and
right.
a bit eccentric.
Right.
But, how do we make sure we don't just weed those people out because there isn't popular opinion that like it at the moment?
Well, just because something is crazy or eccentric doesn't mean it's good.
True, yeah.
So, you have to use your artistic judgment on all matters.
Yeah.
And, different people are attracted to different types of things and different types of artistry. And
yeah.
I know what I like. I tend to like the maximal experience when it comes to musical art.
Mm-hmm.
I would much prefer to hear something well put together that has a purpose than something that meanders and could, in my mind, be confused with background music.
Yeah.
And Beethoven, to get back to your original point, you're absolutely right. Beethoven cared about the way his music was received, but he cared more about the way it was received and propagated into the future. Okay. He, by this time, age 32,
yeah.
understood that his music would outlive him. And he was one of the first composers to think that way. And he was very concerned with issues of interpretation, the first and foremost of which is tempo. When you buy a house, everybody talks about the 3 most important issues being location, location, and location.
Yes.
Well, in music, the first point of interpretation is tempo, tempo, and tempo. And so, a lot can be done. And he went a long way to try to, largely a failed attempt, but to try to standardize tempos. And we can talk about this more in the Beethoven context of the Beethoven
yeah.
Festival. But one other thing that I think is important is that Beethoven was obsessed with his art. He wasn't just a person who happened to write music, from 1 to 4 in the afternoon. His art was his life. And he was obsessed with the expressive nature of what he was trying to create and the architecture of what he was building as well. In other words, the structure of music was just as important to him as music in the small. The overarching global significance within a piece was part and parcel of the local details. So almost a kind of unified field theory in a way for a certain piece. So as part of this, he was an obsessive sketcher with musical sketches. And he would sketch something in either his pocket sketchbooks or desk sketchbooks. He would keep these sketchbooks with him all the time, literally. He moved many times in Vienna. He was a terrible tenant. He constantly got kicked out of buildings. He must have moved something like 30 times in his 35 years of Vienna.
Yeah.
Nobody wanted him. And he kept all of his sketchbooks with him no matter what. He also wrote out autograph scores. And these are scores that musical scores that he sent to the publisher for their engraving and eventual publication. And I actually brought something with me today that illustrates one of the very interesting, at least I think interesting points with respect to a later sonata. This is going up to Opus 109, so it was about 5 or 6 years before his death. And it's in the middle movement of a 3-movement piece, Opus 109. This is part of the, I'll just hold this up so that everyone can see it, and then I think we'll be able to display something on the screen as well. This is a copy of one of the pages of this autograph score, which resides actually in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. So, you can log on and see this. What Beethoven wrote is clearly in ink, and in the first word, though, he added a couple of letters after he wrote in ink, he wrote it in pencil. His typical process was to go through an autograph score with his pen, and then go back and check it over and make any changes in pencil. And in this case, he changed the word presto, which is very fast, to prestissimo, which is an extreme version of presto. All printed editions of this work have the correct prestissimo. But I think it's interesting to understand what he initially thought of and then changed. So if I'll just play this piece, this movement is totally out of context, but just indulge me for a moment while I play this sort of presto. And I'll stop there. So you can see that it's dramatic music, but if you actually, and it's, it's sort of fast at that tempo, but prestissimo, which is extreme, would be this. And it changes the character completely. So that's an example of tempo being paramount in the way not only you play the piece, but the way we as listeners perceive it.
And he was very conscious that he was writing for someone in the future to play this, presumably. And
Absolutely.
That's part of the sketching, part of his process.
That's right.
He was very aware that this would live on, and he had to give some instructions somehow.
Yes, he had to give instructions somehow. Later on, he tried to give more precise instructions with an actual metronome, beats per minute. And he assigned metronome markings,
Right.
the exact beats per minute for only one sonata.
Yeah.
Which, funnily enough, many people think they think it's inaccurate because it's too hard, it's too fast. But actually, the British Museum did an experiment with Beethoven's metronome, just like Beethoven. It's the exact copy of it, because Beethoven's friend Mezzel invented the metronome, so there are many of these still extant. They doused it with olive oil, which was the worst possible lubricant that Beethoven could have used for his metronome if it was inaccurate.
Yeah.
And the effect was zero. There was no effect. So the assumption is that Beethoven's metronome, at least for me, was accurate. And that's the conclusions reached by the British Museum and other musicologists. And yeah, these tempos are hard, but so what? It's part, either you make the commitment or you don't.
Yeah.
If you're climbing Mount Everest, you're not gonna say, well, maybe I'll get to the top. You're gonna do everything you possibly can to get to the top.
Well, and it's interesting how he was sort of leaving an invitation for the future as well.
Right.
Like, okay, if you're up for it, come and play, do this. But it's interesting that he's almost only inviting those who are as serious as he is. Not for perfection, but right. Because they appreciate what he's done and what he's built.
That's right. He had a vision, to mix metaphors, he had a vision of art, vision of musical art. And he wasn't going to water it down. He wasn't going to dilute it. And, even with certain works, certain other piano works, he wrote for a keyboard which was, the work demands a keyboard larger than he had at his disposal, because he knew that the piano manufacturers would gradually increase what was possible.
In time.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's incredible. But that's, like you say, that kind of integrity to knowing that you have to hold to something and actually not compromise on certain things, even if everyone around you is not quite with you on that journey yet.
Well, the point that we had discussed when we were thinking about our conversation here today, the fact that Beethoven's late works left audiences scratching their heads.
Yeah.
But yet, when he died, everyone knew that he was something special. And, he had tens of thousands of people at his funeral in Vienna, even though, there were no recordings. There were, if you wanted to play music, you made it yourself.
Yeah.
And that leads, of course, to a different level of understanding as well.
Yeah.
So.
And I just think that, that's fascinating that people would know that something's special but not necessarily like it. And there is a question, isn't there? Like, it's okay for people to have a reaction to art and music that isn't the same as other people's or isn't all about loving it.
Right.
It's about raising a question. It's about, you know, a conversation. We've had conversations about pieces that you have clearly a very in-depth understanding that I don't, but there's a conversation to be had about that afterwards.
Right. Yeah, there is, and there's a lot. I think a lot has to do with the way we, all of us, listen. There are many levels on which to listen. You know, you can listen on the surface. If you're hearing something for the first time, you listen on the surface, and you know, in some sense, listening on the surface can be very gratifying. And what you were saying before about listening to pieces that you already know, or something that's, you know, that's like a wonderful conductor with whom I've worked several times used to describe that kind of experience as taking a nice warm bath. You know?
It's comforting.
Right. But sometimes you want to dive into a cold lake, which can be more bracing and invigorating in different ways. And if you play new music, you know, stuff that's hot off the press, as all of this was.
Yes.
Or if you strip the layers of sometimes just dusty old accumulated tradition off the stuff and play it as if it's new for the first time, like what we were doing with the chromatic bass line here, then it's fresh.
Yeah.
And if you, so you can create a surface level that's good. You can also listen to what we began to do in the very first example that I gave, with the first and second themes being in versions of one another. Just to remind everybody, we have this. And then a little while later, and if we can sort of have in our ear this second level of listening, this idea that here's a theme, there's another theme, they relate to each other. It's not just, you know, listening on the surface to something nice burbling along. There's another level of appreciation.
And I wonder whether location is quite key to that, because something we're sort of experimenting with in the city is placing culture, music, live performance in kind of unusual and alternative spaces around the city. Some of that might be connected to nature. Some of it is about you encountering it on your everyday, because you're in a different headspace when you do that. Perhaps you're more relaxed, perhaps you're not, perhaps you're with family, perhaps you're alone, but I think there's something quite interesting about people hearing things in different locations as well, different settings, and what that kind of does to their listening ability. And it's a bit of an experiment for us as a city, I guess.
I think it's an interesting idea, and I think it's in my mind, it's certainly worth exploring.
Yeah.
And you know, because people do listen, everyone listens in a different way. You know, we can all talk about it, but ultimately, music is its own language, and you know, whenever you talk about it, you're translating something. You know, but certainly listening in different spaces is a different thing, and you know, you cannot control the way people listen necessarily, except by asking them to come to a certain environment. You know, we can listen to a Beethoven Third Symphony as we're cooking dinner, or we can sit down and actually really listen to it.
Yes.
And the two experiences are very different.
Yeah.
You know?
But I guess, you know, if you go back to what Beethoven was doing, he was extending an invitation.
That's right.
And that's, I think, what we do with arts and culture and music is we extend an invitation.
Right.
It's not for us to set out at the beginning of that what you will experience, how you will feel. We extend that.
Right.
People take it up or they don't. But that's the opportunity, isn't it?
Absolutely. And you know, different composers, we've been speaking a lot about Beethoven because of this upcoming festival, but you know, different composers had different types of invitations.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, Chopin, for example, wrote a whole series of nocturnes. The night obviously is always, can conjure up all kinds of images, all kinds of magic, all kinds of special elements and moods. I'd like to play a little bit of a Chopin Nocturne, but first I'll just talk about it. We didn't have, in this, we didn't have an overarching melodic theme, something you can sing. However, Chopin was a master of creating overarching melodic themes. So I'll just play this piece. I think it'll be easier than talking about it. And this is a work which has a soaring melodic theme supported by an important but subservient accompaniment in a very sort of traditional sense, but evokes a certain element of the night. So Chopin used the piano obviously in a completely different way from Beethoven. It came a little bit later than Beethoven, but it's a completely different style. It's, you know, people have labeled it the romantic style. Those labels sometimes are meaningless, but it is undoubtedly a different type of work altogether.
It feels slightly easier to engage with, but that doesn't mean it's of any greater or less significance. It's
Right.
just very different.
It's more like a warm bath.
Yeah, it's a warm bath.
So there are different ways of using the elements of music. You know, time is critical. You know, music exists in time. It's unlike a work of visual art where, you know, you can see it on your own time. You can walk around it. You can look at different aspects of the picture. Music exists in a continuum of time. And that's even a specific piece. There's a beginning and you flow in time to the end. But the way that the work of art influences our perception of time is sometimes critically important. And the more we understand the different levels of perception, you know, the surface, themes below the surface, even larger global connections, that also influences the way we ourselves perceive time when immersed in the work of art.
I think it's interesting how we use that to bring people into that conversation, invite people to kind of experiment with music and understand it on different levels, and all of a sudden you've got maybe a different audience that are keen to engage with it or understand it in some way.
Yeah, you know, I agree with you, and I think that understanding, as we started off speaking about earlier, understanding the person, you know, Beethoven coming from a very poor background, this, you know, what today would be labeled a disadvantaged background, relying on his talents to pull himself up. Yes, he was able to secure some patronage along the way, but it was based on recognition of talent. And he educated himself largely. He was very self-motivated, and so the ways in which people can, you know, pull themselves up and understand the crises that a composer may have faced, and understand challenges and ways to you know, rise above them. You know, that can be inspiring.
Well, and that he, like many others, used his circumstances, his environment, his situation to inspire his work.
That's right.
There's a direct correlation, isn't there? So
that's very direct.
Actually, that, you know, if someone has the ability within themselves, even if they don't have a network around them, to use that experience to create and sort of shape their talent, then there's huge opportunity there, regardless of who you are, where you are, what you're doing at this moment in time.
That's right. Yes, and it's a degree of self-reliance, which is, I think, important. And that's where the creativity comes from.
Absolutely.
You know,
it's innate, isn't it? I mean,
that's right.
You know, there are certain things about, and this was always the case in art college, there are certain things you cannot teach about art and creativity. there is this innate ability of people,
Right.
and it's whether you can delve deep enough to find it,
Right.
and then to rely on it
Right.
in a way that drives your absolute being and your determination.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. If we can create the circumstances that allow that,
Yeah.
that's the best you can do. I think there are many ways of thinking about acting. There's I'm not an actor, obviously, but you have to assume the role of a piece of music, and there's what I understand in very high-level terms, the Stanislavski school of I don't know whether the word is acting or drama, and that is, rather than, if something great happens in a performance, something that you really like, rather than saying, hey, that's great, I'm going to do it again tomorrow, rather than doing that, recreate the circumstances that allowed for that moment of inspiration, and then see what happens.
Yeah.
And that's what I prefer.
Yeah. Well, and it's kind of applying that to a city scale is really important, isn't it? What we need to do now in this city is create the conditions for culture to flourish.
Right.
It's not necessarily about programming it
Right.
to the nth degree
Right.
and kind of managing it and controlling it. It's about creating the conditions.
Right.
And I think that's your job and my job,
Sure.
and for others in these sort of similar roles, whether that be within educational institutions or in the public domain.
Mm-hmm.
We have a role to create conditions that allow these things to happen.
Absolutely. And so, maybe there's some questions about what we've discussed.
Yeah.
So once again, if any of you in the audience has a question, please do feel free to share it with us. Sometimes questions are the most interesting part of the evening. So, I see that someone's already sent something in. This is from Elizabeth in Plymouth. Which of his compositions, I guess Beethoven's compositions, had the most influence on other composers going forwards? Well, that's a great question. If we had 3 hours, we could talk about all of the compositions that had influence, but I'll start with one. I think it would be the Ninth Symphony. It would be his composition that had the most influence going forward. The Ninth Symphony was a work that Beethoven, ninth of nine, so it was very much toward the end of his life. He brought together forces that had never previously been brought together in a symphonic context. Huge orchestra, huge chorus, 4 choral soloists, and perhaps the reason for doing that was not just to have a lot of people on the concert platform, but because he had a particular idea that he wanted to share, and that was the idea of universal brotherhood. Years before, he had decided to set Schiller's Ode to Joy, which is about universal brotherhood, to music, but he never quite got around to it. He sketched a few things, and then toward the end of his life, he pulled together his sketches, and the most famous part of the Ninth Symphony is the part we all know. But the way it takes 35 minutes to lead up to that, because there's a lot of background, and then you have this Triumphant Ode to Joy. So that influenced many different things. It influenced people. It influenced Brahms. Beethoven himself cast a huge shadow over the rest of the 19th century because he was such a towering artistic figure. The fact that no one, including Brahms and others, Schumann, felt that they could write a symphony after the ninth really spoke to something. So, to put this into slightly different perspective, Beethoven was about, in his early 20s when he composed his first symphony. Mozart composed his first in his teens. Brahms waited until he was in his 40s because he felt that there was nothing he could do that could compete favorably with the Ninth Symphony. The Ninth Symphony also influenced Wagner, and more in our day, this Ode to Joy, the universal brotherhood theme, has been played, at various Olympic settings, and of course it was played or conducted by Leonard Bernstein when the Berlin Wall came down 30 years ago. What better message is there to send? So it continues to have political significance today as well.
It's interesting you're talking about that influence isn't necessarily about people wanting to copy, but actually just be a better version of what they are. Right. So, you were saying he waited because he knew there was no comparison he could give. So actually, in a way, his influence is about propelling people's own work into another dimension that might not have been possible if he hadn't have put that challenge on the table to them.
Well, that's very true. And he created a new kind, he used the musical language to create new contexts and new structures, new architectures, and to create works that, you know, once a genie's out of the bottle, you can't put it back in.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, you know, a series of new works, particularly his late works, exerted, late string quartets and late piano sonatas, Beethoven's, exerted a huge influence going forward. And Beethoven sort of synthesized, you know, like Einstein, he was searching for a unified field theory in music. And he almost got there. Einstein almost got there too, but I understand there's some issues with quantum mechanics. But that notwithstanding, Beethoven almost got there with his very last piano sonata, Opus 111. He synthesized a whole lot of different musical forms into one piece, but it had two movements. They were very contrasting movements, but there were two nonetheless. Liszt took it to the final step with his one movement sonata. And ever since then, anyone who's dared to write a piano sonata, including Scriabin, for the most part, their adventurous works are one movement. So, you know, it's a different kind of perspective once you have that, that new angle on art. So, we have another question from Colin in Totnes. Why did Beethoven stop playing the piano? Well, there are several reasons. Beethoven stopped playing the piano when he was in his mid or early 30s because of his onset of deafness. He had previously played a lot publicly, but he felt he could no longer hear in a way that was dependable for that sort of performance issue. But taking your excellent question, Colin, one step further, Beethoven also stopped writing for the piano. He didn't write up until the day he died for the piano. As I mentioned earlier, the piano was evolving as in technology as an instrument throughout the early part of the 19th century, and Beethoven was in the vanguard of that advancement. He was constantly being asked for his endorsement. No one wanted to play a piano after him because he was so, you know, he demanded so much from the instrument that a third of the strings would be out of tune and some of them would be broken. So no one wanted to touch an instrument after him, and he also demanded more from the instrument through his compositions. But ultimately, his compositions surpassed what the pianos of the day could give. And so there's a famous letter that he wrote after having written his last piano sonata. He said, "No more. I'm done with the piano. It is and remains an inadequate instrument." Of course, he didn't have the modern Steinway at his disposal, and I've often wondered what Beethoven would feel about the modern Steinway. I think he'd be very pleased indeed. From Jenna in Plymouth, how did Beethoven's deafness influence his composing? Great question. Of course, he could no longer hear, or his deafness evolved to the point where hearing was quite difficult in a way that we can, but he had his inner ear, and he knew the way musical language worked. And of course, it could be said that because he was no longer confined by conventional constraints of hearing, if you want to call them that, he allowed his inner ear to influence his creative imagination in new ways. He actually evolved the musical language considerably. He involved the way music is put together, the way architectures or pieces of music are structured, and hearing on a scale which did not rely on surface hearing, but rather something happens here and you work your way through, and something else big happens here, but what happened there is connected to what happened at the beginning, and you have a much more global unity of a piece. That was new.
And arguably would never have ended up with what he did if he hadn't had his deafness. I mean, it was clearly a part of what enabled him to create what he did in the end. Right.
Absolutely. He was a whole person. Yeah. I mean, and his deafness enabled him to become perhaps more abstract. Yeah. And that abstraction found its ways into many different media. Yeah. So, we have about just a few minutes remaining, probably 5 minutes left or so. So we have one other question from Ravenna in London. Is it true that the music of the older Beethoven is harder than the music of the younger Beethoven? Well, you know, that's almost a trick question, because you know you could say it depends on how well you want to play it. Assuming that you want to play it well, the music of young Beethoven's pretty hard too, but the music of the older Beethoven is more abstract, and I think that it's really important to be able to understand the continuum in his life, to understand the compositional continuum, to understand the stylistic continuum, in order to interpret the multiple layers of and levels of meaning that inevitably exist in his later works. From Fernando in Barcelona, is Beethoven your favorite composer? Well, I'll ask you.
Well, I don't know actually. I just feel that with Beethoven, like you say, there are so many more layers than perhaps other composers, and that there is that invitation that he gives to kind of get to know him through this, and I don't think you get that with other composers. So, favorite, I don't know, more challenging maybe, or more of an invitation to explore than other composers.
Right. I think that's well put. I think that while I'm playing Beethoven's music, certainly he's my favorite composer. But while I'm playing Chopin's music, Chopin is my favorite composer. So, you know, we're lucky to have so many opportunities to perform and listen to many different styles. There are times when I'd much rather hear a Bartók string quartet or a Schoenberg string quartet than anything else. There are times when I'd much rather hear a work of the avant-garde composer Milton Babbitt, whose music I liked a great deal and was involved with also a lot, more than anything else. And there are times when I'd much prefer to hear the Bach-Goldberg variations.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's a wealth to choose from. There's one final thing that I'd like to say to kind of wrap this up before asking if you have any further thoughts. And that is, one of the things that we're doing in our Beethoven Festival, and I invite all of you to be part of this in March, is that I mentioned Beethoven's sketches.
Yes.
We're bringing in the Ruisi String Quartet to play a program of Beethoven string quartets, including his very last string quartet, his Opus 135, for which Beethoven sketched extensively. And I thought it would be a cool idea, in fact, I think we discussed this pretty early on, to take some of Beethoven's sketches, which maybe didn't find their way into his final product, and recast them in the language of our 21st century and create a new work. We're doing just that. We've commissioned a composer who is an internationally renowned composer, Jonathan Dawe. He's done a lot of work in the States and elsewhere in Europe. And he is right now taking these sketches and recasting them into his compositional language that relates to, obviously, Beethoven's in a very clear linkage, but through the refraction of time in the 21st century. So that'll be one of the featured works in our festival.
Fantastic.
So we have about a minute or two left. Any further thoughts?
Well, other than that, I feel very privileged to be here and have this sort of private performance, which has been fantastic. But I think what we've discussed as an opportunity for Plymouth is that there are so many individuals like yourself and other musicians based here that create an opportunity for us as a city to open this conversation, extend this invitation for everyone and anyone to start exploring arts and culture, start realizing, you know, what the connection is to them personally, to their lives, to their situations. And I think people will be surprised at the relevance of even Beethoven or you know, other people from history as well as current. So there's a huge opportunity for us to open a conversation, and I'm pleased that we've done so today.
Well, I'm very pleased too. Thank you very much for coming.
You.
And I think that, you know, we invite all of you to continue to participate as members of at least a virtual audience and hopefully soon to be real live audience in our music forums going forward. And you know, language music's a form of communication. There are many forms of communication, but I know of none finer. So thank you for being with us this evening.